What are we talking about? So you know that we're obviously kind of keen on listening here at Harkn, and it's impossible to talk about listening in any meaningful way without also talking about voice, silence, and power. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to do this in 3 sections. So the first, really thinking about the dynamics of what encourages us to speak up or not, and why that matters. We're going to talk about the power dynamics. In the second section, we'll talk about the power dynamics associated with speaking and listening and how our roles as leaders shape those, shape who gets heard and who's not. And then we'll talk a little bit about reimagining voice and different ways of, I guess, approaching this listening subject. Okay, at the end of each section, we'll have a little breakout or a plenary discussion. And as I say, we are recording, but I will not include any discussion that we have in the final sort of edit. All right, we'll take those bits out so everybody can be relaxed about that. But before we go any further, let's set the scene and talk and talk about what we mean when we talk about employee voice. So firstly, it's a multifaceted concept. There isn't a single definition for employee voice, and I picked out a bunch of different definitions that come from academic research over recent years. So, of course, it goes way beyond speaking up, and for us, and I think it should be for other organizations that we work with as well, it's a fundamental aspect of workplace dynamics, and it's about culture, accountability, and adaptability. So it's about influence. So Purcell's work talks about voice as the ability to impact decisions for employees, right? So do I get an influence? Do I get to shape the way this organization moves forward? It can take many forms. So Marchington and Wilkinson's work sets out the fact that it isn't just surveys, it's not just tools like Harkn. It comes, voice is used in many, many ways through formal structures, informal interactions and conversations. And that means we should be looking to utilize every aspect of voice in trying to understand our workplaces. It can support accountability and ethical behavior. So, and this is probably one of the things that we hear lots about, isn't it? So this sort of speak up, speak out sort of mindset associated with voice, ethical governance, enabling employees to hold leadership accountable. And similarly, slightly differently, sort of Freeman and Meadows' work looked at voice as an early warning system, which is really about spotting, I guess, those concerns and risks before they escalate. And every case of employer or organizational malfeasance really has an element of this, whether that's Boeing, whether it's France Telecom. You see countless examples of where voice was either silenced or not heard or simply withheld, which of course influences the outcome for each of those organizations. So there's a sort of unifying definition that takes account of all these things. So employee voice, and so this it's not a formal one, this is what we think, but the employee voice is the ability for employees to express ideas, concerns, and insights that influence organizational decisions, culture, and direction. And why does it matter? And lots of reasons. So engagement and retention. I think I like Hirschman. This is not that recent, 1970s work. And I think for me, Hirschman's work speaks to the sort of, I guess, the messiness of voice. So when people speak up, even if that's in emotional terms or frustration, it's a sign of loyalty. It's a sign of people wanting to make things better than they are. And that's often confused inside organizations. We know things like dialogue is crucial to innovation and agility. We know, of course, it's about resilience and growth. So the ability to make sense of our world and support one another, all very important stuff. That's Amy Edmondson, of course, and she's done lots of work in this space. And because it helps with risk prevention, so early warning system, as we've already said. But I think there are better reasons. So why does employee voice matter now more than ever before? Well, constant change in all sorts of ways, whether that's through strategic imperatives, technology, or ways of working. Understanding how your people are doing or how they're experiencing those shifts is fundamental. So it's about not navigating complexity Adaptability is more than innovation. It is about responding quickly, right? So it's about understanding where we are right now and adjusting our course accordingly. Yeah, and it's about maintaining a healthy culture, right? So this strong, resilient culture built on open, continuous dialogue. And we could talk about aligned, engaged, and supported, but I mean, right in there is this sort of trust and belonging thing, right? So we know that trust is derived from care, and I think it becomes a fundamental part of organizations being able to cope with the amount of change. And so continuing this point about why employee voice matters now, there is more change, more significant change than ever before. That's having an effect for sure. Leaders need to better understand where their people are, and employees need an outlet for their ideas, for their emotions and their challenges. And I think that's a really fundamental thing. And Margaret Heffernan, I quite like this quote. So for good ideas and true innovation, you need human interaction, conflict, argument, debate. It's essential that employees feel able to speak their mind without fear. And that's from Willful Blindness, a book worth reading for those who haven't. So having set the scene, talk a little bit about why it's so difficult to speak freely at work. So this sort of first section, so what's happening? There are lots and lots of unspoken rules and taboo topics, things that we know simply can't be talked about. And I think in any organization in which we work, we sort of get fairly quick information about what we can and can't say through the reaction of others. I think there's something really interesting about the right kind of feedback. Yes, we like information. Everybody likes feedback that comes perfectly wrapped up in a way that I know exactly what's being said. I know exactly what's expected. I know exactly what's to be done, but it also needs to be framed in a very positive way. And I think that's not reality. That's not helping people to speak freely. And the what's missing from that, you know, when people vent or they express negative comments, and think about the Hirschman comment I've already made, but when we express those sorts of things, it becomes too easy to dismiss that as unhelpful and disruptive, but there's a lot of information held in that. And I think the third thing here is related to those unspoken rules and taboo topics, but there are cultural expectations and peer pressure. So, you know, understanding not just what the organization will and won't tolerate, but what our colleagues expect of us, what's okay to talk about, the behaviors that fit around each other. And that makes a really big difference to what people will and won't say. And the result, and I think this is the sort of the takeaway from this first section, the result is there's a massive set of questions that people will ask themselves before choosing to speak up. Is it worth the risk? Is it worth the judgment? If I say this thing, if I raise this idea, this issue, is it going to harm my position or my future here? There's lots of different ways that might happen. Will it make it seem like I don't belong or I don't fit? Should I bother if nothing is going to change anyway? Am I qualified to speak on this? So things that I might experience but don't know that much about. And just so these are ways that you can think of all the different ways that this might manifest in anybody's thought process. Am I crossing a line? So is this going to step into one of our taboos, one of our cultural no-go areas? And then there are, you know, that it's not all. I think part of the language associated with this subject, speak up, speak out, often implies that we're challenging, and I don't think it's always about that. You know, am I creating? You know, is it worth creating friction over this? You know, there's something might happen as a result. And the last one I think is interesting too, which is, will my comment make somebody else feel uncomfortable or defensive? And so there are lots of reasons that we might not speak up. And this self-censoring thing that happens as a result is a big miss. Right? If I'm worried even about slightly embarrassing my boss, if I'm worried about embarrassing my boss by raising it a level above them, if you think about Ask Me Anything type sessions or town halls, and you ask the question, that maybe you feel should have been filtered through the organization's channels, then actually you can trigger any one of these things. And I think the point is, I don't imagine that anybody's sitting down with a checklist going through this stuff. But what happens is we ask ourselves lots of these questions live and sort of in real time, and then it becomes easy just to say nothing. And so I'm going to sort of stop presenting for a second and just come back into the room. And the three questions just for discussion: what topics, subjects are still not okay to talk about at work? Second one, and again, these are just conversation starters really. Have you ever experienced a time where something didn't sit right with you and you chose not to speak? And so what would have been behind that? And have you ever been on the other side, noticing that people are holding back from telling you things, and what might be behind that? All right. Power dynamics and voice. So I guess a slightly different lens now. This quote from Megan Reitz and John Higgins: "So the issue of who gets to speak up and who doesn't, who has a voice and who doesn't, is at the heart of leadership, innovation, and ethics." And when it comes to listening, the power is almost always with the listener. And that slide used to say the power is always with the listener. But the last time I did this, somebody went, no, the power is always with the power. So, okay, well, all right, it's almost always. But I think, you know, if we think about this, so yes, where power exists, whether it's real or imagined, that's sort of broadly true, isn't it? But I think if you ask anybody who works in communications or employee engagement or anything like that, as you know, or leadership, and how often the things we say land and what we realize that our ability to take in, act or not according to instruction, information, is controlled by lots of things. But particularly in this idea of listening to people, we have an awful lot of control over what they say and what they don't, and you know what gets said. And particularly faced with challenging feedback, I think this sort of next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways that we can, I guess, contribute to the things I was saying before, to all the reasons that people don't want to speak up. So it's very easy to dismiss or diminish what we're hearing. The first thing we can do quite naturally is question the veracity, the truthfulness of the feedback, the opinion, or the perspectives. And this is, again, particularly a leadership challenge, but it applies to many people, of course. And you know, if you think about, again, where power is not necessarily held in positional terms, but can be just influential people in your office, and every company has them. This doesn't match my personal sense. Right? I don't get this, and so this doesn't feel like a realistic portrayal of you know, my experience at work. It isn't something I've personally experienced, so I'm not sure it's the reality. It's not sure it's held by many other people, probably just you, and then you end up again dismissing or diminishing. And I think this last one is probably true, and it's part of the reason that you see so many issues, particularly associated with sort of major corporate failings. If this were really true, I'm sure somebody else would have said it by now, you know, and it would have come up sooner, wouldn't it? You know, and I think it's very easy. So there's a sort of volume over quality thing that we apply here as well, so that if only one person is saying it, it's very easy to dismiss it. The point is, everybody else is looking at the person who said it and saying, well, I'm not going to have any weight to that, because we sort of know what happens to people who do. And so I think that sort of that questioning the truthfulness of the feedback, you know, is a major problem. Right? I don't recognize this. And if you imagine that you are the CEO or a member of the senior executive group, and you walk around an office, you will experience a very different lens of life inside your organization than everybody else does. It moves at a different pace. People behave differently. You know, they'll be doing things in a different way than they would otherwise. The credibility of the source is the next thing. Right. So, and you come back, Natalie, to the thing we were talking about the way we present information. You know, these all fall into the same sort of bucket here, don't they? But where is this feedback coming from? You know, oh, it's David, it's always bloody moaning. We can just dismiss that, right? what position, what experience, what authority. And if the listener is doing that, of course, it's forcing us to again, self-censor. Am I credible? Am I qualified to speak? What's going to happen? Can I articulate this properly enough that the source becomes credible? Do we constantly reach for evidence and supporting materials, all that sort of stuff, rather than just saying, actually, this is what I'm experiencing. And the last one, new ways to label. And even having introduced anonymous dialogue, where there is no way of knowing who's saying what, one of the things that struck me in a most interesting way was how often we would see organizations referring to the people who are making negative or challenging comments, or the ones voicing concerns about things that are happening in the organization, how often they were labeled in a collective as just the usual whingers. And no matter how often we'll say, but this is not the same people that you thought were saying it last time. It's not like there are 6 of them talking about stuff. This is a broadly held set of views. But what happens is for comfort and in a way to try to, I guess, control the accountability we must take for feedback, we label in different ways. So the usual whingers is one. There are lots and lots of others, right? And I think this is a really important one as well, right? So we can seek to diminish it, and this is not exclusively for leadership, but because it feels personal and it challenges our identity. So how much of our identity we derive from work? Of course, we work all very hard, and people invest a lot of energy, and that our professionalism, our credibility, our authority to speak on stuff gets challenged. But particularly when it comes to people expressing things about the workplace that we're in. And if I'm in a leadership position and my job is therefore responsible for creating the conditions in which people can do good work, and people are telling me that that's not what I've created, or that people are experiencing something, that can feel sort of pretty painful. And it makes us do things like, and there are people that don't actually say this, but we know they think it, and they'll say something similar. It makes me uncomfortable. I've lost count in organizations of the number of people in leadership positions who just say, I'm just not interested in hearing this, right? Negative, it's demoralizing. It's actually, but you cannot shrug your shoulders. Right? You are accountable. These are the conditions that you're creating, and you're getting the feedback, and you need to listen. You do stuff with it, right? Makes me look bad, and we can understand that, like, it's a personal sort of sense of a sense of embarrassment. But I think, the great leaders will lean into these things and accept that actually, I want to know if we got it wrong, we can change. I have control over, I have agency to do some different things. I think the last one here, is negativity. Where it's negative, it's dangerous. It spreads. There is a massive misconception about attitudes to negativity. It's quite interesting. The joy multiplies, good feelings multiply. We like that positivity multiplies, and somehow we've got ourselves trapped. And I think largely the sort of positive psychology movement has convinced us of this, but that's relatively new. There's an older expression about a problem shared is a problem halved, that sort of predates. Negativity does not spread in the same way. Actually, what we think about, and Wendy talks often about this, but you get things like co-regulation. I am struggling here. I need some help. I cannot make sense of this stuff. When we're going through major organizational events that become traumatic for people working inside the firm, then you start to think, okay, well, actually our ability to support one another becomes part of the caregiving that helps us maintain trust, belonging, and ultimately, of course, our institutional resilience. So I think there's a sort of misgiving here about reasons that challenging feedback gets silenced or diminished in our heads, and it absolutely shouldn't. And there is, of course, a multiplying effect that's happening. So the sort of power dynamics associated with listening don't extend only to the people ultimately responsible for listening. But of course, most of us in hierarchical environments are expected to pass information upwards. And so I tell my boss about something that isn't working very well, and they will go through the same checklist we talked about in part one about what they share, you know, and ultimately, what does that mean? It means that by the time it gets to the top of the organization, it is filtered beyond all recognition. And there was a wonderful experiment that happened live. It wasn't intentionally an experiment, but it was with an organization that half of whom used Harkn and the other half didn't. And they did some fairly substantial changes, you know, the sort of stuff that affects people's careers and income and all that stuff. You can probably imagine the sort of change. But basically what happens is, you know, in the boardroom, they're talking about how have the messages gone down, how has the communication landed, you know, usual grumblings on the ground floor, but people are okay. And the part of the business using Harkn went, well, actually, that's not true. That's a million miles from true. We have, you know, people are absolutely furious with the way that we've done this, about the timing of the, you know, of this thing, and the way that we've communicated it. Some people found out on Teams, some people found out on Slack and Yammer and, you know, all the social channels, because we didn't communicate effectively, and that's caused a lot of hurt, and it forced them to go back and send out their HR business partners to go and, you know, sort of validate. And then what they came back with is, actually, you know what, Harkn's absolutely right. People are, they're more than grumblings. And I think that it is a really important thing. But of course, you know, you know, if we were to rely on those informal and I guess this sort of upward movement, natural movement of information in organizations, then all of the things we've talked about so far play a part, and we end up not knowing. And that means our decision making is less good, our agility or adaptability is less good, and we are not making the right course of action to help us move forward. And the last one, this is absolutely a dig at surveys, and I'm unashamedly going to do it. But if we just think about the power at play in the way that we listen in organizations in the formal way, if that makes sense. We've already talked about the way information moves, but we're going to choose some questions that we've carefully curated, or that the survey company has decided that we need to ask. And here are the ways that you can respond, and here's when you can do that, and so the period in which we're going to listen. And as a result of that, we are going to decide what we're going to act upon. And that is normally the squeakiest wheel, but it's also the squeakiest wheel that is palatable. And we end up with this kind of, and we've come back and said, no, please go be engaged. You know, you said, and we did. But life is more nuanced than that. Organizations are more complex, more dynamic, and our needs are broader than that. And you know, it's a sort of fairly spiky point for me, because I'm normally a little bit softer than this, but it is a sort of a relic of control and centralization. And the problem here is it reinforces the fact that people don't feel heard, their voices don't feel valued, and it will recycle this whole idea that there is nothing worth saying because nobody is listening properly. And so we're stuck, right? So we're back to this sort of thing that listening, silence, and power are inextricably, or sort of voice, silence, and power inextricably tied up in the whole listening conversation. So on to discussion 2. So how does power, positional or perceived, influence what gets heard in your workplace? Have you ever found yourself in a position where you felt you didn't have a voice, or it went unheard? And how did that feel? Have you ever dismissed feedback or someone else's perspective for any, you know, so, and why was that? And did any of the biases that we talk about play a part? All right, so let me come back and we can have a quick chat. Reimagining voice and listening. Don't know what the source of this quote is, but I really like it. Listening is a magnetic force. It holds people together and builds trust, but it requires intent and patience, especially when you're hearing things you may not like. And so this last bit, I guess I just want to share some of the things that we think about, that sort of play into the way we're trying to do things at Harkn. And they certainly play into the way that we are imagining our solution, if you like, but they're here as sort of provocations and thoughts that we might talk about in a moment. Okay, so voice as collaboration, not just feedback. So what if we can reframe the way that people speak in our organizations to help us understand our shared reality, so it becomes a sense-making tool, not just a "you said we did" kind of trigger. And that sort of principle about sort of weaving it into our day-to-day work, and not only aimed at leadership. I think that's one of the other things. It's not always upwards. Actually, quite often you see, particularly with benign commentary and people having fun with voice, and in the way we see it, of course, it's a tool for collaboration, sense making, connection, and you know, it becomes a form of liminal space, right? Place that we can come together and understand stuff in the gaps in our day and the way that our world sort of shapes up, and so seeing it as not just a call to action for leadership, but actually for leadership to be observing and to be taking an interest and to be participating on an equal footing, if you like, but actually thinking about this as peer-to-peer dialogue, or multi-directional dialogue. The second thing, embracing the unfiltered truth rather than to the unfiltered truth. So what's missing when employees feel they must filter what they say? I've covered this in lots of different ways in this session already, but the safety aspect and the I guess the sanitized version of feedback means we miss stuff. If I have to check my emotions, if I have to make sure that my feedback is delivered in a particular way, if I have to attach my name to it, for example, then what are we missing, right? And I think that there's a whole load of stuff in there that come back to the point we were talking about in the last sort of breakout. When we really start to tune in to the sorts of things that people are saying, think about why they're being said, not just what's being said, and also think more about what might be intended rather than what's actually written, so that we are thinking about, because I'm saying written, it would be said as well, of course, so the delivery, the crux of the message, not the delivery of the message, become really important. So getting to unrefined thoughts and embracing the messiness, if you like, and frustration in particular, that we see, whether that's lashing out at the organization, at its leadership, or even at colleagues, is often signs of something else. You know, I think we see that as signs that somebody is not coping with what's going on, particularly. But it might also be a call for urgency. It might also be a call for attention, that something needs looking at here. Accountability. So how might listening change if employees felt that their voices speak to real action? So we'll be sharing shortly sort of Harkn flywheel, a reinforcing, momentum generating way to think about voice that can actually help build trust and connection. But I think here accountability is really important, because if we don't take action, if we allow ourselves to dismiss or diminish feedback and therefore don't do the right things, we are creating greater cynicism. Right? We're creating the sorts of issues that cause voice to become something that might be negative or challenging to us, or presented in different ways, because actually it starts to not matter that much if nobody's listening anyway. And I think that sort of closing the loop point is absolutely crucial. You know, employees to speak, to share their ideas, their concerns, their experiences. You must close the loop. Let them know that you are hearing what they're talking about. And of course, there's multiple ways that this can happen in organizations. It can be a peer-to-peer thing, but leadership should be tuning in and ensuring that that message is closed. And there are still too many leaders, as I've said before, that prefer to put their fingers in their ears and just not do this. It doesn't seem important, but I think there's a very, very deep human need to be listened to. Anonymity is a path to unbiased, inclusive dialogue. So we think that rather than as a stepping stone towards some state of future psychological safety and openness, we trust people to use their voice in this way, and then we're going to move off it, and we've always said with Harkn that we will put a toggle in place that says one day you can flick the switch and suddenly Harkn will not be anonymous anymore. We've never had to build that. We have no intention of doing that because we're a million miles away from that position in most organizations, right? But I think that the more importantly is I think a deeply held belief that we have that this anonymity is crucial to breaking down the social stigma, the social barriers in the way that information moves, right? So all the things we talked about so far talk about why it's hard for us to speak up, why it's hard for people to listen, and if we want to get to the where the subject matters more than its delivery and more than the deliverer and all that stuff. So it's what's being said, not who's saying it. That starts with anonymity. And if we can embed that in organizations, it becomes that foundation, as I said here, foundation for honest dialogue, where power dynamics create hesitation. So it's a way to get out of identity-based bias, and start to tune into what's being said and make it easier to hear what otherwise you wouldn't hear or you might overlook. Curiosity as a default mode for listening, essential, I think. So it's so easy to sit in judgment. And again, all the things that we talked about, our ability to judge feedback, it's to channel your inner Ted Lasso, isn't it? That choose curiosity or be curious, not judgmental. But I think it's really interesting that, that point I made about it's not my experience. And so that bias that I was referring to, you said we walk around the office and I don't experience this, I don't see this myself, I don't imagine that this is what other people are seeing. If we're able to start to tune into some of these things slightly differently, well, what if that were true? And why would people feel the need to say that? What's happening in the organization? It's not it isn't a reflection of us. It might be a reflection of the conditions that we currently have, but it's also a guide, isn't it, for the things that we need to be doing differently. Organizations say they want diverse perspectives, they say they want different opinions, and that we know that lots of good things come out of diverse perspectives, for sure. That actually, if we can embrace that and start to be curious in our response. So, do you know what? Because I don't have an answer to that. Why don't we do some more work together? Like, why don't we try to get into a more nuanced understanding of this particular issue? And there's a great example, an organization we're working with at the moment around workload. Like, workload is a deeply personal thing, right? And there's lots of things that drive that, and our individual needs around our lives will influence how we feel about workload. And and we've done work on this in the past, but I think it's really interesting to say, well, because we can't find a single solution to that, let's go back and find out more about the different ways that workload manifests in people's experiences and start to tackle it in that way. And that's going to start to help us to make sure people feel heard and valued. And my final point, let's get beyond periodic listening. Episodic or listening every now and again is not a way to understand anything. We need continuous and real-time dialogue. The speed with which organizations are moving, the amount of change we've talked about, and we write about this often, there's lots that we've talked about in previous sessions, it isn't sensible or viable, really, to only tune in to certain things at certain times. And what we really need to do is embrace and sort of immerse ourselves in the day-to-day realities, because that's it. When we know where our people are, then we can meet them there, and that's going to give us a greater chance of moving an organization forward faster. And that is ultimately what everybody's trying to do, right? How do we take a group of people trying to achieve a common goal and move quickly towards it? And you can't do that if people are not, if we're not meeting them where they need to be. So, so this point, of course, this again aimed at surveys, but I think it's also more about employer-led listening. So what do I want to hear? What do I think I need to know in order to direct this organization or to lead this organization? Well, what you need to know is what your people want to share with you, right? And what you need them to share with you is the stuff that you need to be hearing. And that will not come from 25, 40, 60, 150 carefully curated questions. It has to come as it's happening, because people are really good at understanding the context and what matters right now to them. So that's it. The last bit of our plenary discussion, which is what resonates most about what we've talked about today. What's the biggest impediment to implementing some of the things, or to changing voice and listening? And what do you imagine would be different in workplaces that listen the way that we've talked about? Okay, let me stop sharing and come back.